Sure, Marion. No need for introductions. I think I know almost everybody here, and met during the. So I'm Chris Borick from Muhlenberg College. For those that might not know me, and I think I can't even begin to think how many times I've had the privilege of talking to the league over the years. Tells you a little bit about my age and how long I've been around. So it's probably good that I can't remember, but it's always an honor. And as I said dozens of times during the years, how much I value and everyone should value an organization like this that is committed to engagement in our democracy, and that's the salience of this endeavor is as clear as ever right now. So thanks as always for the work you've done, the work you will be doing, and the key role you play in American democracy and citizenship. So with that, I guess theme of why I was asked this particular talk was to look back a little bit at the election 2020. And as folks had noted already in our discussion, today's a monumental day in that long process of an election, with the Electoral College meeting as another step in our institutions and structures as we move to a new administration, and now slightly over a month, right? About 5 weeks, I guess, is the timeline. So lots to look forward to, and I will talk a little bit about governing, the reason why we have elections. I'm reading finals today for my elections class this fall, and I always stop. The last project is to talk about the consequences of elections, right? What happens? Why do we have elections? We spend so much time in that class trying to predict election outcomes and look at the factors that lead to what happens, but that's not the end game. The end game is to govern, and so I'll talk a little bit about governing as the result of election 2020. But let's look back, if we will, a little bit. And so I'm going to share screen with you, and oops, we don't need that. And hopefully, just gonna get my slideshow here. Oops, very good. Can everybody see that? Okay, good. I always like to check in, so I'm not talking about something no one could see, but this is our December Hot Topics luncheon, and the topic is a little bit of a debrief on what happened going forward. So I'm going to take a look at the national perspective in the next 20 minutes or so, a little bit about Pennsylvania, look at the exit polls and county level highlights, some of the things that we might have seen at different counties around the country. I'll look at a little bit about polling, which is always a big topic and lots of concerns and questions coming out of 2020. And then on to a quick thought or two about governing in 2021. And then, of course, the most fun part, questions and answers from all the nice folks here today. So with that being said, I'll start with this, and this should be a great place for us to start, a kind of a nonpartisan civic engagement thing and the level of turnout. 2020 was exceptional. Someone that studies elections and we look for outliers, 2020 had a lot of them. But let's start with those numbers. And I think I took this from the New York Times just last week. Then the number of votes, right? The 2020 and a little bit more since probably have come in, but those 2020 totals blew away any other election. And you might say, well, that's just the product, right? There's more people in the country. Of course, that's part of the equation. If you look back over time, this line should go up, just, even if it's a smaller percentage of the population because the population is bigger. But look at those numbers. Biden's number cracking 80 million, Trump about 74 million. Those are unbelievably high numbers of Americans voting by almost any standard. So we had over 150 million Americans vote. You look just in 2008, which we thought about as one of those key moments in American electoral politics because of the turnout. There's about 20 million more people voted than 2008. Now there are some more people in the country, but not proportionally. So the story about turnout was there. And that was one of the things that seemed easiest to predict. There are all kind of indicators pointed to that level of engagement, people talking about the importance of the race, that there was a difference. And so those things came through. As you know, the popular vote is always important to look at. But most importantly, it's electoral college, and we've talked about that today as the electoral college meets. Where were the electoral votes? And that 306, again, the inverse largely of the electoral totals of 2016. Just swap your parties and you have the same totals. And that was led by 5 states that were different, that flipped from 4 years ago. And you know those here, I'm sure everybody does, the famed kind of former blue wall, or maybe rebuilding blue fence or whatever we might call it, picket fence, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and the 2 additions, Arizona and Georgia, into that mix. And again, as we'll say, you know, this is an election where from a popular vote, it wasn't all that close. You know, we're talking over 4% and, you know, 8 million votes or so, somewhere in that range, 7 to 8 million. That doesn't seem all that close. But if you look at these 5 elections and you sum up the totals, just like 2016, it was very close. Arizona and Georgia and Wisconsin, all around, you know, between 10 and 20,000 votes. Pennsylvania, about 80,000. Michigan, a little over 100, 120 or something in terms of that. So it was certainly not a election where it was a runaway, just like 2016 was in terms of electoral college. A few votes here and there could flip it, and that's been part, other than, you know, 2008 and 2012 to a lesser degree. A lot of elections in the 2000s were very close in electoral vote. 2000, of course, when we go to Florida, no need to remind you there. But 2004 was actually very close. If John Kerry had won Ohio, which he lost by over 100, just about 100,000 votes, he would have been the president and flipped the electoral college. So there's a lot of, you know, races like this. And once again, 2020 does fit into that mode. So what happened? Where did the flips come? You know, in those 5 states, first of all, these are states that aren't all that unaccustomed to being close, just like I've talked about before. Look, Pennsylvania, of course, you know, we knew, and you can go back over time. In 2016, Trump won with only 48%, you know, beat Clinton by less than 1%, you know, around 47%. But a lot of races over time. Biden's going to win with just about 50% this time. But in 2012, Obama won with 52%. He did win fairly convincingly, like he did almost everywhere in 2008. But 2004, 51%, 2000, 51%, 1996, and there were pro elections, so they're a little bit changed. But you can see the races in Pennsylvania are often pretty close. We don't see blowouts here, along with a lot of those other states over time have been fairly close. And just look at those numbers going down in 2020 for the 5 states that flipped. Biden won with 50%, 51, 49, 49, 50. Close elections, but we see over time that's often the case. Now, flipping Georgia and Arizona is unusual. We haven't seen that since the 90s. But the relative closeness of races is something that's not all that unique in a lot of these states. Georgia and Arizona trending Democratic in some of those years over time, but not and some of the, as we saw in these 3 states, really close elections. Where did it come down to? Kind of the changes from 2016. Everybody, I have my students looking at this, and I've been thinking about it, and everybody is. Where were the big changes? Where did it shift? What was different? And there was a lot that was similar. You know, some of the Trump areas got even more supportive of the president. Some of the Biden areas, Democratic areas, became even more supportive. But the big gains are in these places. I'll start with there are a couple pockets where President Trump gained over 2016 in significant ways. Southern Texas, Southern Florida, largely Hispanic, or large portions of Hispanic Latinx voters. Those shifted dramatically from 4 years ago in the direction of President Trump, and that helped him. Florida very much played a role and helped him relatively comfortably win Texas when it was seen as a pretty competitive state. And so you saw those areas. Other places you look at, well, where was out west? Utah is a bit of an outlier. It's a very Republican state, but in 2016, there was a third-party candidate, Evan McMullin, that had a big percentage of the votes. So Trump gained because there wasn't a third-party candidate here. So that's a little bit of an outlier. But where do you see the big blue movements? And you see it in the suburbs, which is a big part of the story right here. Suburban Philadelphia. Maryland and Virginia aren't all that important because they were considered some safe Democratic states, but the Baltimore, Washington suburbs, it pushed even farther democratically. The all-important Georgia suburbs, Atlanta area suburbs, moved dramatically Democratic this time around and helped play a role there. In Texas, even though Texas ended up remaining Republican, the shift that's happening in places like Dallas, Austin, Houston, those areas were big. And of course, in some areas, we could see it doesn't look that big on the map, but modestly moving a place like Wisconsin, Milwaukee area, and the Detroit suburbs in Michigan were key players in moving those states. Again, not all that far percentage-wise from 2016, but clearly in the direction. So there's a lot of suburban impacts that coming close to home in Pennsylvania. As you can see, this is the 2016 and 2020 maps, and the now conventional red is Republican, blue is Democratic breakdown that we always look at. And they don't look all that different in terms of their color distribution, just some shades differences. There are only two counties that flipped from 2016. Erie County, which narrowly went to Trump in 2016, narrowly went to Biden this time. And right here in the Lehigh Valley, Northampton County, which Trump won by about 4 points, I think, in 2016. Biden won by about a point this time around. They're the only two that actually flipped in which candidate won the most votes. The rest is all intensity, right? Just changing things. And you could see some of the dark red areas got even redder this time. A few of those rural counties in Pennsylvania. But most importantly, I think to the outcome difference is the intensification of blue in a number of counties, particularly Montgomery County and Delaware County down in suburban Philadelphia. Big. Clinton won those counties sizably last time, but Biden, in just the yield that he took out of the counties this time, was exceptional. And so you saw winning those places, ramping up the numbers in some places like Center County, where Penn State is, and Harrisburg, Dauphin County, doing that. Monroe County performing a little bit better up in the Stroudsburg, the Poconos up there, but largely the biggest gains were in these places, as we'll see. Here's an example to show you, and this is my most complicated graph, so I apologize, but I'm a professor, I got to show some of these complicated looking graphs. This is the comparison of those 4 counties in Philadelphia, suburban counties: Bucks, Montgomery, Chester, Delaware. And the x-axis, the horizontal axis down here, is Trump's share in 2016. From this is the 50% mark. So anything on this side, Trump got a majority in 2016. Anything on this side, Clinton won. And over here is Trump's share in 2020. So anything above, Trump won in 2020, above 50%, anything below. And as you can guess, most counties, most townships in suburban Philadelphia went to Democrats in both races. Most that went red in 2016 continued to go red in 2020. There were a minority of those Philly suburban towns and municipalities, but there was a big chunk, 35 municipalities that flipped from voting to Trump to voting for Biden in those areas. So they moved from having 50%, this is over the line, for Trump in 2016 to under 50%, and some of them down into the mid 40s. So this is how much he scored there. So that little pocket right there. But you could also see, and here's the key, almost in all those suburban towns, this is the line that would mean it's perfectly equal percentages over both. You can see it all drifted south of that line. So areas that were Democratic before became even more Democratic. Trump's shares went down. Even in places that he won in those suburbs, his share went down. So the suburbs were crucial in many ways in Pennsylvania, like they were other places, to Biden's victory and Trump's defeat. I'm going to look a little bit, kind of thinking about, who were these voters in both the suburb and beyond. And this is from some of the exit polls that we're looking at. And the exit polls are still being kind of all worked and clarified, so they're not perfect yet, but they give us a sense, right? And you could see that, as we would think, what are big determinants of our vote, and gender and race are enormous determinants of how we vote. And you can see that, right? Among white men, which made up about a third of the electorate, a little over a third, Trump won 6 out of 10 of those voters. Among white women, this is notable, Trump won just over 50%. So he won a majority of white women. Now, it's very close, as you could see. And again, with the exit polls, we'll take them for what they're worth. It could be, a few points off. But that's key to think about, that even among white women, that the president held that. So among white voters in general, the president did well, as you might expect, given patterns in America among Black Americans, Latino, Latinx folks, all others. The president didn't do as well. Joe Biden won 87% of Black men, 93% of Black women, which, by the way, is the most loyal base of the Democratic Party. If you're looking at one kind of place where the intersection of gender and race comes together, that's the group. Latino men, 59%. Again, 6 out of 10 Latino men voted Democratic, but that's down from last year. Same with Latino women. This is one group where Joe Biden won, but not by the margins Hillary Clinton did last time. And also among others, including Asian Americans, a slight decrease. So what's interesting is these patterns hold, as you'd expect. On both sides, the percentages actually got lower. So among white men and white women, Trump did worse than last time. Among almost all of these demographic groups, even marginally Black women, Trump did better. Of course, the big picture is Biden won those groups, Trump did, but on the margin, we saw them actually move closer, which is an interesting phenomena. You can get even more granular, right? And now bring in education, and you start to see some of the things popping and explaining some of those suburban trends. Among whites, both men and women without college degrees, the president won, at least 6 out of 10, even more, almost 2 out of 3 white non-college men. Among white college men, Trump hung on 52 to 46%, but much closer. And those are some of those suburban areas. But here's where it starts to flip. Among white college women with college degrees, Biden won 60-40 or 6 out of 10. And those in suburban areas, you could tell that's kind of that coveted female suburban vote that the president was trying to creep back in and get some of those votes at the end, and never really did. And that was crucial. Among other groups, as we look at those people with color without college degrees, Biden did won almost 7 out of 10, even more with those with college degrees, and as you can see, dominating in those areas. But this kind of split right here was part of the suburban picture. The rural-urban divide. This is striking to me. Kind of the inverse, that you can almost flip these numbers and see how they're the mirror image in some ways, that America, that rural-urban divide, 2 out of 3 rural voters voted for Trump, 2 out of 3 urban voters voted for Biden. It's that's the starkest divide. And then as you kind of move away from cities and the real rural areas and get into suburban and small town, you also see the inverse, that in the suburbs, places that are classified as suburb, Biden won by 10%. In the small towns, which there are a lot of in a place like Pennsylvania, including where I'm speaking to you right now from Nazareth, it's 55-43. So it's actually the flip. It's so, you couldn't design that better, right? In some ways, those numbers to paint the picture, but it is part of American politics right now. Of course, as a group like this is well aware from trying to play a role in showing what positions are by candidates, issues in the presidential vote, how did that break down? And you can see what's interesting is, even though we're in the midst of an economic turbulence, one really striking facet, the economy and jobs. If you said that was your biggest issue, President won 4 out of 5 people that identified that said the economy. And largely our polls show that the president, despite the economic turmoil, gets high ratings on his economic handling. Handling of the economy. And that was among those voters something that played out. However, if you look at the other kind of big issues, and this is a little high of the way this was asked here, the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic 41%, that was the biggest group that said it was their key issue. 73%, 3 out of 4, turned to the president. And I can't understate just how important I think the pandemic was in terms of there's never one kind of magic issue or magic demographic, but this comes pretty close in terms of its potency. It was a highly salient issue among people that really cared about it. The president got terrible ratings on his handling, and it was salient, and you could see the breakdown there. Other issues like healthcare also that performed higher in some other polls. Biden dominated on people that thought healthcare was the #1 issue, and you could see some other differences in there. If you're, law enforcement issues or immigration was big, you voted for Trump. If you were on climate change, it's a big issue, you could vote there. But that kind of tells the picture. Couple of other things, takeaways from this election: the educational divide grows. This is the change in the number of votes cast by county types, and I'll explain. These are kind of big counties in the country that are predominantly white and college educated. In other words, a majority of the residents are white and have college degrees. Kind of think of your places like Montgomery County down in Pennsylvania, and outside of Philadelphia, or Westchester County, New York, these places that are really highly educated and predominantly white. Biden gained 26% over Clinton's number 4 years ago. Now, Trump also gained, like he did, just bigger turnout, but only by 11%. So the yield to Biden in those places was much, much greater. However, in counties, kind of large counties that are predominantly white, but the majority of people don't have a college degree, Trump gained. He gained again by about 4 points over Biden, comparatively to Biden. Both gained, but you can see he actually expanded the lead there. But look at that gap right there. So again, those are wealthy suburbs. I'll add some more things in this that make it even more kind of striking. These are large counties. Change the number of votes cast by county. These are large counties with a white majority. Just have a white majority. Biden won by 26%. So if you had large counties with a white majority, Biden gained 26% over Clinton, Trump only 18. But here's interesting: majority white, college educated, and Republican. And I want to make the point, this is really fascinating, that counties that have registered or Republican majorities in them, places where people identify as Republican, it's a majority, Biden gained 21 points in those. You talk about things like the Lincoln Project and other projects that kind of targeted high educated, conservative leaning Republicans. This is where they off in places like that. Trump only gained 7% relative to 4 years ago. Trump did make gains in, as we noted before, in majority minority counties. Changes in the number of votes cast by county type. Large counties with a majority minority population, in other words, most of the individuals are not white, Trump gained 30% over 4 years ago compared to Biden 22. So the gains made, right, among that group was actually a bigger yield for Trump. In those majority Hispanic counties, this is big counties in the United States that have a majority Hispanic population, largely Southwest Texas or Texas areas, Southern Florida, a number of those areas, some California. Trump gained 37% over 4 years ago compared to Biden only gaining 19%. So that's where a lot of the gains were. In predominantly black counties, it was more or less a wash. Trump gained by 1% more, but that was in some of those areas. This was areas that Democrats thought they could really gain. Getting out that turnout, and that Trump was able to offset that a little bit in part of the picture. So cool. I just want to give you kind of a run through that. I want to quickly turn to polling in 2020. The popular narrative is polling failed, that it clearly didn't accurately give us a sense of where this election was headed. And I'll totally agree that there were many kind of polling issues that have to be looked at this time. There were certainly major misses. Place like Wisconsin that ended up being about a 1-point margin. The poll averages were in the high single digits, so it didn't give a pretty clear picture of what was happening there. However, even with that said, and I'm not dismissing polling lapses, the national polls, in the end, the averages were about 7 points. It's going to be about 4.5 points or so difference. Historically, we'll see that those are kind of where the gaps are, right? National polling, if you're off by about 3 or 4 points, that's kind of where presidential races are. We see some that are closer, some that are more, but it really wasn't incredibly abnormal. It overstated, and that's what we'll talk about before the gap on the Democratic side again, which is a problem. The state polls, as we said, they were mixed. Certainly there were big failures like Wisconsin, but a lot of other state polling was pretty accurate. Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina all showed the races largely as dead heats. They ended up largely as dead heats, right? Close 1 point or so. Even if you look at Pennsylvania, the final margins in Real Clear Politics had it about a point or so. The other aggregators had it a few more points. It ended up being about a 1.2% race. Certainly it was overstatement of Biden's lead, but not gigantically. 48, and this isn't the best way to measure a poll to say if it predicts the winner, because that line that crosses over is, if you call it close and it just crosses over, well, it could still be a really good poll. But 48% of the aggregates this year aligned with the winner. So if you went in before Election Day and said, who's leading? And just kind of discounted the margins, you'd say, oh, well, they came up 48 of 50, exactly where it was. I think Georgia might have actually, at the end, in the aggregates, leaned towards Trump, and North Carolina towards Biden. But largely they did. I don't think it's the best way to predict, but just to give a sense. The problem was, in my mind, that the overstatements were really similar to 2016. We'll see over time, polls vacillate, right? They're off by a couple points. It's when they head in the same direction that there's some kind of systematic problem. And I'm going to give you an example of kind of what I mean by that. Here's our polls. Went back and looked. We've been doing this now at Muhlenberg for a long time, since 2004, our first election. We started our institute in 2001. There's a lot of data in here, but I'll kind of make the point. So we've done 5 presidential races now, and this is our last poll. I took our last poll in each of those cycles. And over here, this is where our last number was for the Republican candidate in the poll, in 2004, Bush, 2008, McCain. And here's the numbers that we had, our final poll numbers. Here's what their actual number was, their actual number. So we had, George Bush at 46, he ended up at 48, 42. And the same, as we go down. And here's the same with the Democrats. We had, John Kerry at 48, he ended up at 50. We had Obama at 52, he ended up 54. So often your poll estimate's lower because people are undecided, right? And sometimes there's big undecided. It's like 2016. It's part of the nature. So you'll have some different shifts in years. Like 2016, the shifts on both candidates were. So here's our final margin is what we had in each of these elections in Pennsylvania. And you can see we've had Democrats largely up, and they largely have won in Pennsylvania, but we had Kerry up 2, Obama up 6, Obama up 3, Clinton up 4, Biden up 5. And here's the actual final gap that you had. So Kerry, we had up 2, he won by 2.5. Obama, we had up 6, he won by 10.3. Obama by 3, he won 5.4. This was the one, we had Clinton up 4, Trump won by 0.7%. So this is the gap, right? This is the gap that you see. And we've had some that, I think just got a little lucky, and it varies over time. A really close one there, but most of the gaps are in that range, 2 or 3 points, which is pretty normal for polls. Actually, pretty good if you compare across polls to be in that range. And so you can see that in some years, our bias, if you will, we had understated Democratic for the first 3 elections we did. The last 2, we understated. Our bias direction was in the favor of Democrats, understating the Republican performance, which is the thing that, if I am concerned, like I said before, largely these gaps is kind of normal polling. That the gap in both of these races underestimated the same candidate. And you could say we did the same with Obama in 2008 and 2012, right? Same type of underestimating of his performance. but it seems to be more endemic over the last few years, which raises questions. Are there some polling issues? Is it a silent Trump vote? Are we underestimating Republican strength? I think we have to take a nice deep dive into that, and I'll be happy to talk about that moving forward. Now, quickly on to 2021. We still have elections to take care of. As you all know, Georgia, all the attention of the world is down in lovely Georgia this time of year. And it'll decide if Democrats have unified control of three branches. Well, I should say two branches in the two houses of Congress and the president, or divided government. But that's important, of course, and these races are important. But we really do have divided de facto government. The margins in both of these houses are so small, it doesn't take many individuals on either party to defect to change the outcome. And you might say, well, today it's hard. People don't defect, right? Democrats or Republicans. They still do on key issues. And so it's very, very divided. And it's really going to be interesting to see, more moderate Republicans and Democrats in the Senate will be in the spotlights. The Mitt Romneys, the Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Pat Toomey, who might not be a traditional, you might think of moderate, pretty conservative senator, but in his last 2 years, they're going to be, I think, having a big say in what gets done and what doesn't get done in Congress over the next few years. As will Biden's history in the Senate. He's got a long history. He was vice president, but I think, considers himself a creature of the Senate. His career has been there, and he spent so much time there. And his relationship with Senator McConnell, they might not be best buddies, but they know each other. They're comfortable, I believe, around each other in a way that McConnell and Obama never were. We could talk about their relationship if you'd like, but certainly I don't think they're going to be chums. But I think Biden's knowledge, McConnell's willingness maybe to at least talk to Biden in ways he hadn't in the past could open up some doors. So what are the policies and priorities? You started the pandemic. The first actions that Joe Biden seems to be focusing on is COVID. We're already seeing this before his administration in terms of possible deals on a COVID relief package or the latest relief package, but you're going to see that continue into the first 100 days. The vaccine distribution plans that we're dealing with now that are put in effect under the Trump administration, and how the Biden administration is going to shift those. Executive branch powers are going to play a big role. I've talked about this in my class with my students, right? Of course, you need a lot to be done in unison between the president and the Congress, but the president's roles and regulatory powers are extensive. We've seen that over the Trump years. The president's use of his regulatory powers in areas like the environment, healthcare, education have been extensive. Biden has the power to unilaterally reverse a lot of those things, a lot of the climate plans, a lot of the energy plans, the energy standards, things that Obama had put into effect and Trump took off. Biden's going to flip back. Same with some healthcare provisions and regulatory provisions and education provisions. So certainly we'll see unilateral action on the part of the president elect and the Biden administration. The potential buy-in for major infrastructure. I still think, and this is probably one of the things I was wrong about the most during the Trump years, I thought there was an opening for major investment in infrastructure. The President Trump really doesn't have much of a care about deficits. He's shown that. He's willing to spend. Democrats are interested in major infrastructure, yet nothing really got done on a major way. There was important things that were done. I don't want to discount them all, but not on the kind of the big plan. And so I'm maybe doubling down a little bit. I still think there's openings for there. The Biden sees lots of interest in it, in infrastructure, including green infrastructure and others. Republicans do have, because of business interests, some major interest there. Perhaps we'll see that. Same with criminal justice reform. It's one of the big bipartisan stories, if you will, during the Trump years with criminal justice reform. There's still lots on the table left there, and I think we might see some action there. So if I'm looking at the next year, don't be surprised if those areas are there. But with that, I probably talked a little bit too long, so but so much to share. So I will bring it back now to discussion.
Okay, I have to apologize for taking off my dog. My dog's getting a medical issue, so when she has to go out, she has to go out. So, and that wasn't my dog.
No, that was Max.
um, yeah, I want to thank Chris. I didn't get to introduce him, and he's right. You really do know Chris very well. But some of the things I picked up when I looked at your bio again, I hadn't realized that you've done over 300 large scale public opinion surveys over 20 years. As a political science major myself, I can't tell you how much work that is. 300 public opinion surveys is like full time every week. I just don't know how you get it all done. And then to see that a lot of Chris's results have made it in almost every major print media and TV media in the country. So that tells us that we have a really good guy here who just spoke to us. And I am really excited that you were here. Also, I think I told you when he was here last spring, and I started looking through his bio, I saw that he was very much involved in climate research and has done quite a lot of publishing and research on that too. So I think he's still going to come back in the spring when we do our environmental stuff. And we're going to hear a whole other topic that will also be very important in the next coming years, as we can see with Biden picking John Kerry to run that department. So I just wanted to make sure I did get that out. I apologize again, but if it's open to any questions, should we just go by, Terry, should we just go by the hands raised?
Yes, we're going to go by
Okay,
hand.
then Rochelle and Bob, you have a question?
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Mary. Chris, you didn't speak at all. Could you speak a little bit to down ballot ticket splitting and missed mark with Susan?
Yeah, well, first of all, the down ballot ticket perspective is gigantic part of the story this time around, Bob. When you look at the story of 2020, you certainly can say we got a mixed review, right? Republicans picked up seats in the House. Democrats are going to at least pick up one seat in the Senate, but probably not nearly their expectations that they saw. So there appeared to be a hedge, right? A hedge in lots of voting across the country where the president was by at least a share of voters in a lot of areas, not the taste that they wanted to continue with, while they were very happy to have Republicans fill those congressional seats and others. That seems to be a big part of the story of 2020, and I should have made that clear. The local race, if you look, was more closer than we had seen in the polling. We had it, I think, and this was in September, and this is another kind of polling moment just to talk about. We're polling with an incumbent. Not a lot of people in December were still aware of they know their congresswoman in Susan Wild, but there's a new candidate on the Republican side this time around, with a lot of people kind of with no opinion of her moving forward. And so it's a race like that, by the way, in a lot of the House races, and there were a lot of House polling problems this time. We had Susan's number right around 52%. So she's an incumbent, people know her. This is kind of her threshold. We had Lisa Scheller's right around 39-40%. She ended up in the higher 40s%. So a lot of movement there at the end, which isn't unheard of in a poll. But even with that said, I think and it was what's interesting. Here's the other kind of weird things in polling. Not only we were polling in those districts, right? So we asked how you felt about the presidential race in the same one, and we had President or Biden winning about 7% in that district, and he won by about 5%. So we're in that race where people are kind of solidified. The polling, I think, was more or less right on. In a race that was more, nebulous for some folks, the movement clearly at the end, I think, went in the direction of Scheller. That doesn't mean that we might have done some undersampling and other things there, but it should have appeared if there was a clear bias, it should have appeared in both of those races, right? We should have had Biden way up, but we had him right where we ended up. So it's one of those kind of interesting things where I think some of it was forming as we were relaying. And as I said before, the incumbent number is usually the one that doesn't move as much. People knew Wild, and so she had about 52%, and she ended up there. So that's my best take, Bob, on kind of what happened.
Thank you.
I have a question. When you see how much or how high the percentage was that Trump got with the economy, the issues of the economy, how much of that can you attribute to messaging? Because if we look at Wall Street versus Main Street, Wall Street may be looking good, Main Street no. So how much of messaging would you say could be partly responsible for that?
Yeah, I think certainly it's always part of it, Mary, that, how you craft your message, how you craft your image, how you kind of sell it is certainly part of American politics. And I believe the president has done a good job of that. He's a marketer, right? And his economic prowess, he still has this relationship. It's been part of it. What's really interesting to me is, so we asked people, both in the Lehigh Valley and across the state, back before the recession, before the COVID pandemic struck, do they think they're better off than they were when the president took office economically? 4 out of 10 said yes in February. 1 out of 10 said no, and the rest, the 50%, said it's the same, right? So by about a 4-to-1 that people said that it is different, they leaned that it was better. We did the same poll in the fall, and it didn't change. That even though the economy had changed, the situation had changed, people certainly didn't change their appraisal of their own financial status between the two, which is interesting. That may mean maybe for some it really didn't change for the negative, and they're still reporting that. But some of it is clearly kind of probably aligned where you might view politics and you might view other things, and you're kind of appraising that in your head. So a lot of that is kind of things like messaging. And the macroeconomic indicators, did we see lots of those gains before the pandemic, and that the president might have been getting a little bit of pass, that it wasn't the pandemic, at least the cause of it wasn't his doing. You might say, well, okay, look, he led us good economically, and we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt on that issue. We might not give him the benefit on the handling of COVID, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt on that. I think some of that played in. The president, from an economic perspective, I'm not an economist, but I know a little bit of macroeconomic policy, used all the tools he can to juice the economy. Gave a tax cut even during a period when usually you don't need a stimulus, right? So he stimulated an economy that seemed to be in pretty good shape by macroeconomic indicators, not all income equality standards, but macroeconomic. And he juiced it. And I think he probably saw the benefits for that. And not being, no COVID, no pandemic, I don't know if that message doesn't succeed in that kind of result. So really great point.
Okay. Kathy Stagel has a question. Unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Kathy, go ahead.
Well, 2 things, but I just want to comment on the economy. During the Obama years, people were saying they were doing worse when they really weren't. So I think the perception of how well you're doing is very subjective to who's asking you. But my other comment is I thought that the influence of a polling would be more influenced by people who don't answer polls, which generally I don't do, or people who have cell phones who don't get contacted. Although somehow I started getting a lot of text from the opposition, which I have no idea how they got my cell phone number. So from your results, though, it appears that you were fairly accurate, even taking that into account, that there were a lot of people who wouldn't have answered or had cell phones and wouldn't have been contacted.
At both points, Kathy, yeah, and that it's true. Our perceptions of the economy and the handling of the economy are very much based on our partisan affiliation, right? Even though most of the macroeconomic indicators during the Obama years would say pretty good things about the performance of the economy by things we usually measure as economists, and you'd have a lot of individuals, as you said, say that the economy is doing bad, right? And then in a year, with most of the macroeconomic things didn't flip, it's just a change of administration, you see a change of perspective. And I imagine you're going to see that with the change of administration again. That's part of our partisan lens to politics. So it's a wonderful point and fair point to make, Kathy. And our polling, polling is incredibly challenging right now because of a number of things that you said. Response rates, getting people to take the time to do it, trying to reach out to them. It's more costly, it's more time. We have to, like for us, for example, our sampling, we talk largely to people on cell phones right now. We can, that's legal from a pollster perspective. You can call a cell phone if it's hand dialed, right? It's hand dialed to do it. So it's legal, but it takes a lot of time. It's a little harder to mathematically deduce, when you're trying to balance who you call on a cell. We still have to call some landlines because some portions of the population still only use landlines. So there's a lot of moving targets. Election polling, as for someone that does polling, is the hardest of all polling, because I don't know what the final population looks like because of who's going to turn out or not. We try to estimate that. I know what the overall population looks like. If you ask me to say, as Mary mentioned, a climate poll, what percentage of Pennsylvanians are concerned about climate change, I know pretty much what Pennsylvania adults look like. I can go to the census, right? Now, it's not perfect, but I know it's more or less a number I could target to. I can't do that with elections. I do it, but I have to estimate what that turnout is. So there's lots of moving parts. And that's why I always, back to, I think your takeaway in some ways, Kathy, is you should take polling with, expectations that are reasonable. If you expect the poll to kind of like hit the number on the head, I hardly ever do that, right? It's, like I said, in 2004, we were off by like half a point. We got lucky, right? In some ways, our same polling methods just happened that with sampling, we hit it that time. Most of the time, there's going to be some wiggle room. And from my perspective, like people say, well, how do you think your polls were this year? I said, pretty good. I'm pretty average, right? We said it was going to be pretty close in Pennsylvania. We had Biden, winning, by 5 points or so in our final margin. We had it in the fall at, our other polls at 4 and 7. It was all kind of that mid-single digits. It was closer than we expected, which leads me to believe we probably, because of the consistency of that, had some undersampling, but largely it was a close race. I told people expect a close race. I thought it leaned towards Biden. It ended up leaning towards Biden. So for me, kind of on a macro level, that's a pretty normal cycle. The problem is that it kind of mirrored some of the issues of 4 years ago, which raises that questions about who's not responding and who might not be telling those. And what's interesting, if I had more time, is we had one intervening point, right? Trump's been on the ballot in 2014 and 2016 and 2020. We also polled in 2018. And our polls were good. They were really good in the Wolf and Casey races. They were right on. Now they did undersample. We were slightly above on the Democratic candidate, so it didn't mirror that, but not gigantic. We were right on. So I don't know if there's Trump effects or some other things, but it's certainly something that we as an industry have to think about moving forward.
I see Joyce Moore has a question. Joyce?
I'm sorry. My question was about polling in general. My feeling is that it's generally safe to look at the trends in polling and take the specific numbers with a grain of salt unless you see 4, 5, 6 polls that show one individual leading over another. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, I think so, Joyce. Over the years, we polled a long time, and I think our record is pretty good and solid, but I'd much rather look at an aggregate than I would any of our individual polls. That being said, if the aggregate's not taken in a lot of polls that I'm not sure about, but if it's good polls, in generally, I think, you aggregate them together and you see the trends, and that's pretty successful. And by the way, it was this year too. If you look at it, the margins were tighter, but largely it captures the dynamics of a race. If you see, and I say this every time, you see races that are low single digit margins, expect a close race and one that could flip across that all important line, right? If it's a 2-point lead for a candidate, don't be surprised if that candidate wins, the other candidate wins by a point or so. That's just part of the deal. So have your expectations tempered. Polls can give us those kind of things. Don't expect precision, even on the aggregate, because it's a moving target. You know, the ones, as I said before, in most of the cases, if you look at the polls this time around with that method of appraisal that Joyce suggests, you'd be comfortable with kind of the outcome. There are a couple like Wisconsin that were just so big that there's something funky and some issues that we have to look at. By the way, Wisconsin was the worst 4 years ago too. So something's happened in Wisconsin, and it's odd. I started my career. My first job directing a center was in Wisconsin, so I blame myself. For my Wisconsin connections, something's happening there. But other than that, most of the states, as I said before, you know, that were pretty tight. They probably were a little tighter in the end. But if you had anticipated, kind of, if it was in that close range, that you got a close race on your hands. If any of you saw talks I was giving before the election, and I was looking at the polls, that's my takeaway every time. Expect, if it's close in the polling, just don't start saying, oh, it's a 4-point lead or something. That's done. No, it's no. It's close, and it was close.
I have one more question. And then I think the Burks have a question, the Swans have a question. Chris, I'm kind of puzzled by the Hispanic turnout and the Hispanic vote. I can understand like South Florida and maybe an anti-Castro emphasis, but what explains like how the Hispanic vote split?
Oh, it's a great question. Really a question. And so it's a fascinating group. It's I'm sure everybody knows here, fastest growing demographic in the country, very important in a lot of these states like Texas and Florida, that have become, you know, more competitive. And the argument is, if you could, you know, if Democrats can really solidify that group, they have chances to flip some previously Republican states, Texas being the number one. But that didn't happen this year, largely because of the Hispanic Senate vote not only not exceeding what happened in 2016, but regressing. And it's a really good question. And I think you're right, Mary, South Florida, the messaging to the Cuban population, Cuban American population, which is already Republican leaning, really was I think crucial in moving that important vote in places like Miami-Dade County really farther towards the Republicans, and helped explain, you know, the president's victory there. The Hispanic vote in places like Texas and other parts of the country, which by the way isn't only Texas, it was other places, you know, that had large Hispanic populations that you can deduce from polling and other things and numbers, certainly was crucial, I think, in explaining some of those, the tightening of some races. There's a couple of theories right here. You know, there's cultural kind of arguments, a cultural conservatism argument that I've heard made among Latinx, Latino, Hispanic voters, that Trump's kind of take on some issues apart from immigration, social issues resonates. His economic message, his economic kind of entrepreneurial ideas and messages like that also have been thought to have resonance within the Latino community. Among Latino males, I've heard it argued, and this is again, you know, kind of the evidence that his machismo style, his kind of toughness, resonates and has some cachet that could draw good responses, and you kind of accumulate those, and you make a case that kind of pieced together moved the dial at those points, right? Again, and it was, you know, in the end, you saw the data showed that Biden won the groups, even Latino males, comfortably, but not by the margins that Clinton did. And not by the potential to exceed those and really turn it into a blowout election, right? That was if you looked at a number of states, if that did flip, all of a sudden the election electorally looks even more different, and a number of things. So that's from my takeaway. That's about what I could see right now, Mary. I'm sure there's gonna be a lot more to add to that.
Right. I think Pat Swan had a question. Pat?
Yeah, I wondered where all those Lincoln conservatives are going to go? Are they going to be able to start a new party or revive the Republicans? Or
I love, oh, Pat, what a great question. And both parties right now, I mean, that could be a whole other discussion, kind of where's their direction, right? We've seen the infighting on the Democratic side between progressives and moderates, the tension there that's kind of boiled over. We certainly see it on the Republican side with traditional conservatives, classic Republican loyalist, and I'll use the word Trumpist kind of loosely, that division in that group is real. And so where do you go? Where do you go, right? You know, and that campaign, you saw people like the Lincoln Project clearly weigh in on the Biden side. And I think there's a comfort among those voters with Joe Biden, and certainly no comfort with Trump, and that made it an easy kind of move there. But where do they go now in the long term? That's a great question. Do you look to try and re-win the party that seems to be very much in the direction of the president's vision and present, or do you try to isolate, start anew someplace else? Starting anew is really hard. We know that, right? There's been two parties in American politics that have dominated largely since we have had parties. Their names change, anti-federalist, federalist, Democratic Republicans, with different groups we've had over time. And since the Civil War, Democrats and Republicans. We've had these groups. It's hard to start. There's a lot of systematic and structural impediments to other parties beginning. So it's usually done from within to be successful, or at least taking, ownership of outside groups and kind of incorporating them in. So I think it's hard for Republicans to do that. So do you see a lot of these disaffected folks end up in a Democratic Party? Maybe not, because they, aren't going to necessarily, depending on the direction of the Democratic Party, feel at home if it moves left. So where do they go, right? Do they become kind of independent nomads, wandering back election to election, which could happen, kind of in an independent? Do they become more regional, looking to kind of reestablish Republican parties? We've seen that historically in regional areas that to build up. It's hard. It's hard to see an easy path. I'm really fascinated, by the way, those gains, just to go back to the question about Hispanic voters and African-American voters. Republicans think, hey, we got an in now, we're starting to move in that direction. I don't know without Trump if those folks necessarily would be aboard the Republican. They've got Republican brands really bad in those groups. So maybe there's some kind of move back there. And then some of those suburban voters that are, at least nominally Republicans still, that defected in this election to Trump, or away from Trump, do they, different Republicans see down ballot maybe, do they put a different Republican in there? They come back to the fold. Those are really interesting questions to look down the line.
Well, we're at 1:30, and that's, Kathy, you have a question? Can you take one more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Kathy.
I was just going to comment on the Latino and the Black votes, because they keep being lumped together as one identity, and they're not. But also with the Cubans in Florida, I mean, Cuba has moved forward. When we get to third generation Cubans, are they going to really buy into their parents' identity?
Oh, what a great questions. And first, two things to take. Kathy, your point is so good about not, lumping together all demographics, simply that will say non-white voters, right? They're very different. You look at Asian Americans, Hispanic voters, Latino voters, individuals of mixed race, very different groups. And then you could drill down within the Hispanic and Latino community and see enormous divides between, people of Puerto Rican descent, Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, right? So they're very different within. We aggregate them a lot. One of the reasons why we aggregate a lot too is just because of sample sizes, right? We, when I break out a poll, just have enough kind of diversity. Sometimes we say people of color and and white voters to compare. So there's reasons, but very different. And you bring in kind of the intersection now of generations. And boy, if we had more time talking about those generational divides within cohorts, right? Younger voters of color, younger Latinx voters, younger white voters. very different, right? And there's a big kind of within the world of political science. Sometimes we see generations more or less hold over time. Sometimes we see them evolve ideologically, and it's not constant among generations. Some evolve, some remain more constant. This generation, the one that's just come in over the last 4 years, and maybe the 4 years before that, and 4 years before that, has clearly a more left-leaning bent to it. Now, we've seen that historically, other groups, but this one seems to be a little bit more, a little deeper. And that might, in some areas, like you said, among Latino, Cuban Americans, their third generation folks, how salient Cuba is, right, as a whole, as an issue, and what other things take over, are really going to be fascinating to look at. These are stuff I love to talk about with my class, kind of as we see those over time. So I don't have an answer other than it's going to be fun to watch, Kathy, moving forward.
Did you happen to watch the Binghamton web thing on generational politics?
I didn't. If you could send it.
Oh, yeah, it's actually available on the, but he was really excellent talking about that.
Oh, I would so like to see that. If you do, I'd love to. I love generational politics.
Yeah, I'll have to get your email.
Yeah, I'm sure
I can send it to you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, I think we've held up Chris pretty long. I could go on all afternoon talking to you. I think you know that. I have so many more questions. I'm just going to have to maybe audit one of your classes, which I saw one of them is Springsteen's America.
That's my fun one.
That's
it. Take
yeah. That sounds really different. But anyway, I want to thank Chris. You know, we could have you back every month and we would have hours and hours to talk about in this politically heated climate we're in right now. But I want to thank you so much for explaining a lot of your polling, explaining the results, explaining why we see some of those results. I think we're leaving here a much more educated electorate. So I want to thank you very much for, again, informing us and making us smarter. So with that, I will hand this over to Molly and see what other kind of comments and announcement she has. So thanks again, Chris.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everybody. It was my pleasure as always. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for your questions.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I don't have much to say at this point. Watch the Voter, which will be coming out at the end of the month. Rochelle Kaplan and Mary Erdman have been following some of what's going on in the Pennsylvania legislature coming up. And we'll look to some of you members for help with writing letters to the editor and letters to our legislators to the legislature is looking to redo the judicial districts or set up judicial districts, and also want to make changes to Act 77. So there's some things the league is concerned about. So we would, we'll be looking to you to help out with letters and letters to the editor and letters to your legislature. Beyond that, I guess I want to wish you, a happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. We certainly have the weather today that sort of fits in the season. So good to see you all and have a good day.
Hey, bye-bye, everyone. Happy holidays.
Yeah.